The year is 1932, and in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, a woman walks into a state bakery with a ration card clutched in her trembling hand. The shelves are empty. Outside, bodies lie in the streets, covered with newspapers, waiting for the morning collection cart. Children with distended bellies sit motionless against building walls. This is not a war zone. This is peacetime in the Soviet Union. And what is happening here is considered, by the state, to be entirely normal. In fact, according to official Soviet records, it is not happening at all. The famine that would kill between 3 and 7 million people in Ukraine alone, known as the Holodomor, was denied by Moscow even as it unfolded. Foreign journalists who reported on the starvation were denounced as liars and agents of fascism. Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who would win a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from the Soviet Union, wrote that claims of famine were exaggerated, even as he privately acknowledged the disaster in correspondence. This was not merely a tragedy of nature or poor planning. This was engineered scarcity, the result of forced collectivization policies that seized grain from peasant farmers at gunpoint, exported it abroad for hard currency, and left entire regions to starve. And, in the Soviet system, questioning this policy, offering food to a starving neighbor without authorization, or even discussing the famine openly could result in arrest, deportation to the Gulag, or execution. This was normal. Understanding what was considered normal in the Soviet Union requires abandoning Western assumptions about individual rights, privacy, economic freedom, and even the basic relationship between citizen and state. The USSR was not simply an authoritarian government that restricted certain freedoms while maintaining others. It was a totalitarian system that sought to remake human nature itself, to create what Soviet ideologists called the new Soviet man, a being whose thoughts, desires, and very identity were aligned with the collective will as interpreted by the Communist Party. This was not rhetoric. It was policy, implemented through mechanisms of control so pervasive and so deeply embedded in daily life that, within a generation, behaviors that would seem insane or dystopian to outsiders became routine, unremarkable, and, in many cases, internalized by the population itself. Consider the Propiska system, an internal passport regime that controlled where Soviet citizens could live. Introduced in 1932, the same year as the Holodomor, the Propiska was a residence permit stamped into every citizen's internal passport. Without it, you could not legally reside in a city, rent an apartment, or access many services. The system effectively bound people to their place of registration, preventing free movement within their own country. If you were born in a small town in Siberia, you could not simply decide to move to Moscow or Leningrad. You needed permission from the state. This permission was rarely granted. The Propiska system served multiple functions. It controlled urbanization, keeping peasants tied to collective farms even after the formal abolition of serfdom decades earlier. It restricted access to privileged cities where consumer goods were more available and living standards higher. It created a geography of privilege, where Moscow residence became a prize more valuable than money, since money without access to goods and services was largely meaningless. And it made every citizen dependent on bureaucratic approval for one of the most basic human decisions: where to live. This system remained in force throughout the Soviet period, and, in modified form, continues in Russia today. For 70 years, Soviet citizens accepted as normal that they needed the state's permission to move from one city to another within their own country. The workplace in the Soviet Union operated under principles that would be unrecognizable to anyone familiar with labor relations in market economies. Beginning in 1940, under Stalin's wartime mobilization, but continuing long after, Soviet workers were legally bound to their jobs. Unauthorized absence from work for more than 20 minutes could result in criminal prosecution. Leaving a job without permission was illegal. This was not hyperbole or theoretical law. In 1940 alone, over 3 million people were convicted under these labor discipline laws. The penalties included imprisonment in labor camps for up to 4 months. The state determined not only where you could live, but where you would work, what you would produce, and under what conditions. For university graduates, this was formalized through the system of распределение, or distribution, where upon graduation you were assigned to a workplace, often in a remote location, for a period of typically 3 years. You could not refuse this assignment without forfeiting your degree and facing legal consequences. A young engineer graduating from Moscow State University in 1970 might find himself assigned to a factory in Kazakhstan, 1,500 miles from his family, with no right of refusal. This was considered normal, even necessary, for the proper functioning of the planned economy. The concept of private economic activity was not merely restricted in the Soviet Union, it was criminalized. Under Article 154 of the Soviet Criminal Code, engaging in private enterprise, or what was termed speculation, could result in imprisonment for up to 7 years. What constituted speculation was broadly defined and arbitrarily enforced. Buying goods in one city and selling them in another where they were scarce could be speculation. Providing services for payment outside official channels could be speculation. Even growing vegetables on your small private plot and selling them could, in principle, fall under these laws, though enforcement varied by period and location. The result was a society where normal economic behaviors, the kind of small-scale entrepreneurship and trade that exists in virtually every human society, became criminal acts. Yet, paradoxically, the Soviet economy could not function without these very activities. The second economy, the informal network of private exchanges, barter, and under-the-table services, was simultaneously illegal and essential. Everyone participated in it to some degree, and everyone knew that enforcement was selective and often politically motivated. This created a society where nearly everyone was technically a criminal, and the state could choose to prosecute whenever it deemed necessary. The criminalization of normal economic life was not a bug in the Soviet system. It was a feature that kept the population in a state of perpetual vulnerability and dependence. Privacy, as understood in Western legal and cultural traditions, essentially did not exist in the Soviet Union. Apartment buildings were designed with communal facilities. The kommunalka, or communal apartment, was standard housing for urban Soviet citizens for decades. In these apartments, multiple families shared a single flat, each family occupying one room, with the kitchen, bathroom, and hallway shared among all residents. By the 1970s, approximately 20% of urban Soviet citizens still lived in communal apartments, and in earlier decades the proportion was much higher. In Leningrad in 1955, over 70% of the population lived in such conditions. This was not temporary emergency housing. Families lived this way for generations. Children were born, raised, and reached adulthood, sharing a single room with parents and sometimes grandparents, while unrelated families occupied rooms across the hallway. The lack of privacy was profound and deliberate. It served both practical purposes: addressing the severe housing shortage created by rapid industrialization and wartime destruction, and ideological ones, breaking down the bourgeois family unit and creating collective living arrangements that were supposed to foster socialist consciousness. The communal apartment also facilitated surveillance. Your neighbors knew your comings and goings, your visitors, your conversations. In a society where denunciation to authorities was encouraged and often rewarded, This lack of privacy had serious implications for personal security. The surveillance extended far beyond housing arrangements. The Soviet Union maintained one of the most extensive secret police networks in human history. The KGB, at its height in the 1980s, employed approximately 480,000 personnel. But this number dramatically understates the surveillance apparatus. The KGB relied on a vast network of informants, estimated to number in the millions, who reported on colleagues, neighbors, friends, and family members. In East Germany, the Stasi, the East German secret police closely modeled on the KGB, had approximately 90,000 employees and an estimated 170,000 informants for a population of 17 million, meaning roughly 1 in every 63 East Germans was directly connected to the surveillance apparatus. The Soviet ratio was likely similar or higher in certain periods and regions. What made this system particularly insidious was its secrecy and unpredictability. You never knew who might be reporting on you, the colleague who seemed friendly, the neighbor you helped with groceries. Even family members might be providing information to the authorities. This uncertainty created a climate of fear and self-censorship that was more effective than any amount of overt repression. People learned not to express doubts about the system, not to tell political jokes except in the most trusted company, not to possess forbidden literature, and not to associate with anyone who might be under suspicion. This self-policing became internalized, a form of psychological adaptation to an environment of perpetual potential threat, and it was considered normal. Parents taught children from an early age to be careful about what they said outside the home. The understanding that walls had ears, that careless words could have serious consequences, was passed down as practical wisdom. As normal as teaching children to look both ways before crossing the street. The relationship between Soviet citizens and consumer goods was unlike anything in market economies. Shortages were not occasional disruptions, but permanent features of daily life. The planned economy, which set production quotas based on bureaucratic calculations rather than consumer demand, routinely failed to produce adequate quantities of basic goods. The result was a society organized around the search for and acquisition of consumer items. Shopping was not a simple transaction, but a complex activity requiring time, connections, and often luck. Deficit, the Russian word for shortage, was one of the most commonly used words in everyday Soviet conversation. Standing in line, queuing, became a central feature of Soviet life. People would join a line without even knowing what was being sold, simply because a line indicated that something, some scarce commodity, was available. The Soviet joke captured this reality. A man sees a long line and joins it, and when he finally reaches the front, he asks what they are selling. And the answer is, nothing. We just heard there was a line. This was only slight exaggeration. Lines could last for hours or even days for particularly scarce items. People developed elaborate strategies for queue management, marking their place, taking turns with friends or family members, even paying others to hold their spot. The time cost of acquiring basic consumer goods in the Soviet Union was staggering. Studies from the late Soviet period estimated that Soviet citizens spent an average of 30 to 40 hours per month standing in lines, time that could have been spent in productive work or leisure. This was considered normal. The idea that you should be able to walk into a store and purchase what you needed when you needed it without waiting, without connections, without luck, was understood to be a feature of capitalism and therefore somehow morally suspect, even if practically appealing. The system of Blatt, the network of informal connections and reciprocal favors, was essential for navigating Soviet life. Blatt was how you obtained goods and services that were theoretically available but practically inaccessible through official channels. If you needed to see a good doctor, you used blat. Perhaps calling on a friend who worked in the medical system or offering something of value in exchange for access. If you needed a spare part for your car, you used blat, trading a favor or a scarce item with someone who had access to automotive supplies. If you wanted your child admitted to a prestigious university, blat could be decisive, providing connections to admissions committees or access to preparatory information. Blat was not corruption in the Western sense, though it certainly facilitated corruption. It was a parallel system of social organization based on reciprocal obligations and personal networks. Everyone participated in blat to some degree, and success in Soviet society often depended less on formal credentials or official position than on the strength and extent of one's blat network. This created a society where personal relationships were instrumentalized, where friendships and family connections were valuable partly for their practical utility in obtaining scarce resources. The anthropologist Alina Ledeneva, who studied blat extensively, described it as a form of social capital that substituted for the market mechanisms suppressed by the planned economy. But it also meant that access to goods, services, and opportunities was deeply unequal, distributed not through market prices or even official status alone, but through informal networks that were opaque and often exclusionary. And this was considered normal. The understanding that official rules were one thing and actual practice another, that personal connections mattered more than formal procedures, became deeply embedded in Soviet and post-Soviet culture. The Soviet approach to mental health and political dissent revealed the system's totalitarian logic in particularly stark form. Beginning in the 1960s, Soviet psychiatry developed a diagnostic category called sluggish schizophrenia, a condition supposedly characterized by symptoms so subtle that the patient appeared normal but was actually suffering from a slowly progressing mental illness. The symptoms of sluggish schizophrenia included reformist delusions, meaning the belief that the Soviet system should be reformed, struggle for truth, meaning persistent complaints about injustice or official misconduct, and poor social adaptation, meaning failure to conform to expected Soviet behaviors. In practice, sluggish schizophrenia became a diagnosis applied to political dissidents, allowing the state to reclassify political opposition as mental illness. Dissidents diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia were committed to psychiatric hospitals, often special psychiatric hospitals run by the MVD, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, where they were held indefinitely and subjected to forced treatment with powerful antipsychotic drugs like haloperidol, administered in doses that caused severe side effects, including tremors, muscle rigidity, and cognitive impairment. This practice was not marginal or secret. It was official policy, defended by Soviet psychiatrists at international conferences. The logic was totalitarian in the purest sense. Since the Soviet system was scientifically correct and represented the interests of the working class, opposition to it could not be rational. Therefore, persistent opposition must be evidence of mental illness. Between the early 1960s and the late 1980s, thousands of people were committed to psychiatric institutions for political reasons. The writer and dissident Vladimir Bukovsky, who was himself confined to psychiatric hospitals multiple times, documented this system in extensive detail after his exile to the West in 1976. He provided evidence, including official documents and testimony, showing the systematic use of psychiatry as a tool of political repression. And within the Soviet Union, this was considered, if not exactly normal in the sense of being openly discussed, then at least unremarkable. The conflation of political dissent with mental illness was accepted by much of the medical establishment and the broader population as a legitimate application of psychiatric science. The Soviet relationship with truth and information was fundamentally different from that in open societies. The state maintained a monopoly on information through direct ownership of all media, strict censorship, and the criminalization of unauthorized information distribution. Samizdat, the practice of self-publishing by typing or hand-copying forbidden texts and passing them through networks of trusted readers, was both a form of resistance and evidence of the extremity of information control. Possessing samizdat literature could result in arrest and imprisonment. The texts circulated through samizdat were not only explicitly political manifestos or banned novels, though these were common, but also religious texts, philosophical works, accurate historical accounts, and even foreign literature that did not conform to Soviet ideological requirements. The fact that people risked imprisonment to read Orwell's 1984 or Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, texts that circulated in fragile, hand-typed copies passed from reader to reader, speaks to both the hunger for uncensored information and the severity of its suppression. At the same time, official Soviet media operated according to principles that inverted normal journalistic standards. The newspaper Pravda, whose name means truth, was understood by Soviet citizens to be filled with propaganda and lies. This was so widely acknowledged that Soviet jokes centered on it. There is no truth in Pravda and no news in Izvestia, referring to the two main Soviet newspapers, Pravda meaning truth and Izvestia meaning news. Yet this same propaganda was mandatory. Workplaces held political education sessions where workers were required to attend lectures on Marxist-Leninist theory and current party policy. Schools taught a version of history that was revised repeatedly to match current political requirements. Figures who fell from favor were erased from photographs, Sediner, and removed from historical accounts. This was not subtle. Soviet citizens understood that official history was malleable and political. Yet they also understood that expressing this understanding openly was dangerous. The result was a society characterized by what the philosopher and dissident Alexander Zinoviev called Homo Sovieticus, a type of person who had learned to navigate the gap between official ideology and lived reality, to mouth required slogans while privately disbelieving them, to function within a system built on lies while maintaining some private sphere of authentic thought. This cognitive dissonance, this daily performance of belief in a system one privately doubted, was considered normal. The Soviet approach to nationality and ethnic identity combined official celebration of diversity with brutal repression and forced population transfers. The USSR was officially a federation of republics based on ethnic identity, and Soviet propaganda emphasized the friendship of peoples and the voluntary union of Soviet nations. In practice, the Soviet state carried out some of the largest forced population transfers in human history. During World War II and its immediate aftermath, entire ethnic groups were deported from their homelands on suspicion of potential collaboration with Nazi Germany. In 1944, the entire Chechen and Ingush populations of the North Caucasus, approximately 500,000 people, were forcibly deported to Central Asia in cattle cars. Approximately a quarter of them died during the journey or in the first years of exile. The Crimean Tatars, numbering approximately 200,000, were similarly deported in May 1944. The official Soviet mortality figure for the Crimean Tatar deportation was 46%, though this may be understated. The Volga Germans, ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia for centuries, were deported to Kazakhstan and Siberia, beginning in 1941. Koreans from the Far East, Greeks from the Black Sea coast, Balkars, Karachais, Kalmyks, and others were subjected to similar deportations. These were not evacuations or relocations. They were punitive measures carried out with extreme brutality, often with only hours of notice, with families separated, with inadequate provisions for survival in harsh climates, and with no legal recourse. The deported peoples were designated as special settlers and subjected to severe restrictions on movement and employment. Many of these groups were not allowed to return to their homelands until the 1950s, and some never fully regained their former territories. Yet within the Soviet Union, these deportations were barely discussed. They were classified information. And the deported peoples themselves were forbidden from speaking about their experiences. The official narrative either denied the deportations entirely or justified them as necessary security measures. For the affected populations, the experience of deportation and exile was traumatic and defining. For the broader Soviet population, these massive crimes against entire ethnic groups were either unknown or accepted as normal wartime security measures. The Soviet nuclear program exemplified the state's willingness to sacrifice its own citizens for strategic objectives. The Soviet Union's rush to develop nuclear weapons after World War II was conducted with minimal regard for the safety of workers, soldiers, or nearby populations. The Mayak nuclear facility in the Urals, which produced plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons, released enormous quantities of radioactive waste into the environment. In 1957, a tank containing nuclear waste exploded at Mayak in what became known as the Kishtim disaster, the third most serious nuclear accident in history, after Chernobyl and Fukushima. The explosion released radioactive material across a vast area, contaminating approximately 15,000 square miles and affecting hundreds of thousands of people. The Soviet government evacuated some nearby villages, but provided no explanation to residents, who were told only that they were being moved for unspecified reasons. The disaster was kept secret from the Soviet public and the world for decades. Similarly, the Soviet nuclear testing program at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan conducted over 400 nuclear tests between 1949 and 1989, many of them atmospheric tests that spread radioactive fallout across populated areas. Approximately 1.5 million people lived in the affected zone. Soviet authorities conducted secret medical studies on the exposed population, documenting the health effects of radiation while providing no warning or protection to the people being studied. This was not accidental exposure or unavoidable collateral damage. This was deliberate use of a captive population for medical experimentation and weapons testing. And it was kept secret, considered normal within the classified world of the Soviet military-industrial complex, where strategic objectives overrode any consideration of individual welfare or informed consent. The Chernobyl disaster in April 1986 revealed both the specific failures of Soviet nuclear safety culture and the broader patterns of secrecy, denial, and disregard for public welfare that characterized the system. When Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded in the early morning of April 26th, releasing radioactive material equivalent to 400 times the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Soviet authorities initially attempted to conceal the disaster entirely. The nearby city of Pripyat, with a population of approximately 50,000, was not evacuated until 36 hours after the explosion, and residents were told it was a temporary precaution. Meanwhile, firefighters and plant workers battled the blaze without adequate protective equipment or even accurate information about the radiation levels they were facing. Many of these first responders received lethal doses of radiation and died within weeks. The Soviet government did not acknowledge the disaster publicly until Swedish monitoring stations detected elevated radiation levels and demanded an explanation, forcing Moscow to admit that an accident had occurred. Even then, the initial Soviet statements minimized the severity. The May Day parade in Kiev, less than 100 miles from Chernobyl, proceeded as scheduled on May 1st, with children and families celebrating outdoors while radioactive particles drifted over the city. Local officials who wanted to cancel the parade were overruled by authorities in Moscow, who feared that cancellation would acknowledge the severity of the disaster. In the months and years following the explosion, hundreds of thousands of liquidators, mostly military reservists and workers, were brought to Chernobyl to clean up the disaster site. Many worked in highly radioactive environments with inadequate protection, receiving doses that would cause long-term health effects. The Soviet government maintained strict control over information about Chernobyl, classifying medical records of exposed populations and suppressing research that documented health effects. The disaster became a symbol of Soviet dysfunction and dishonesty, contributing to the collapse of public trust in the government during the final years of the USSR. Daily life in the Soviet Union required constant adaptation to absurdities that would be intolerable in societies with functioning markets and accountable governments. Goods were produced according to planned targets that measured quantity rather than quality, leading to predictable distortions. Factories that were assigned quotas by weight produced heavy, unusable products. Nail factories famously produced either enormous numbers of tiny, useless nails or small numbers of giant, equally useless nails, depending on whether the quota was measured by number or weight. Textile factories produced fabric of such poor quality that it was unwearable, but the quota was met. Construction enterprises built apartments so shoddily that they required immediate repairs, but the plan was fulfilled. Stores stocked goods that no one wanted, while goods that people actually needed were unavailable. The Soviet consumer learned to buy items not because they were needed immediately, but because they were available, leading to hoarding and further shortages. The Russian phrase, "just in case," became a principle of consumer behavior. You bought shoes even if you didn't need them, because shoes might not be available when you did need them. You accumulated goods as a hedge against future shortages and as currency for barter in the informal economy. This behavior was rational within the Soviet system, but it created a self-reinforcing cycle of shortage and hoarding that made the consumer goods problem even worse. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 was not the result of military defeat or foreign invasion. It was an internal implosion driven by the accumulated contradictions and failures of the system itself. By the late 1980s, even the Soviet leadership acknowledged that the system was not working. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, were attempts to reform the Soviet system while preserving its essential features. Instead, they revealed the extent of the dysfunction and delegitimized the foundations of Soviet power. When censorship was relaxed, the Soviet public learned the true scale of historical crimes, environmental disasters, economic failures, and present-day corruption. When political controls were loosened, nationalist movements emerged in the republics, demanding autonomy or independence. When economic reforms were attempted half-heartedly, they disrupted the planned economy without creating a functioning market, leading to shortages even worse than before. The system that had seemed permanent, that had shaped the lives of generations, that had been considered normal by hundreds of millions of people simply collapsed. The Soviet Union ceased to exist on December 26, 1991. Dissolved by agreement of the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and the Russian tricolor was raised in its place. 74 years of Soviet power ended not with revolution or war, but with bureaucratic procedure and resignation. The legacy of Soviet normality persists in the post-Soviet states decades after the USSR's collapse. The Propiska system continues in Russia in modified form, still restricting internal migration. The BLAT networks that were essential for navigating Soviet scarcity have transformed into corruption networks in the post-Soviet market economies. The surveillance culture and distrust of authority remain embedded in social relations. The acceptance of state power as arbitrary and unaccountable shapes political culture in many former Soviet republics. The environmental damage from Soviet-era industry and nuclear programs will persist for generations. The demographic consequences of Stalin's terror, the war, and the social disruptions of Soviet rule permanently altered the population structure of the region. Perhaps most significantly, the experience of living in a system where official reality diverged so dramatically from lived experience, where truth was political and facts were flexible, created a cultural cynicism and epistemological uncertainty that complicates the development of democratic institutions and civil society. When nothing is true, anything is possible, and the distinction between propaganda and reality becomes a matter of power rather than evidence. Understanding what was considered normal in the USSR is essential for understanding not only Soviet history, but the nature of totalitarian systems generally. The Soviet experience demonstrates how quickly human beings can adapt to conditions that would seem intolerable, how social norms can shift to accommodate even extreme forms of control and deprivation, and how systems of power can sustain themselves through a combination of coercion, propaganda, and the manipulation of everyday life. It also demonstrates the human capacity for resistance, the persistence of private thought and unofficial culture, even under conditions of pervasive surveillance and ideological saturation. The Soviet Union created a form of modernity unlike any other, an industrial society organized according to principles that rejected markets, individual rights, and political pluralism. For 74 years, this experiment shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people across 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. What was considered normal in that system, the daily accommodations and adaptations that people made to survive, and sometimes thrive under those conditions, reveals both the malleability of human social life and its limits. The system ultimately failed, but its legacy endures, a reminder that normality itself is constructed, contingent, and potentially fragile, and that the defense of open societies requires constant vigilance against the mechanisms of control that, once established, can come to seem natural and inevitable.